Claire, is this you?
50 of the world's most beautiful women, and he hadn't spared a glance for a single one. Baek Jin-ho stood at the center of the glass-walled penthouse gala, a champagne glass held in a grip of iron, watching models in shimmering gowns glide past like expensive toys designed for his amusement. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow that reflected off the Manhattan skyline, but Jin-ho's eyes remained cold. To him, their rehearsed smiles weren't an invitation, they were masks, polished, plastic, and entirely hollow. In a room full of the world's most desired perfection, the King of Shadows felt absolutely nothing. This gala was billed as a high-fashion auction for global peace, but Jin-ho knew the truth. In these circles, peace was just a word used to negotiate territory. The elite were here to climb ladders made of old money and fresh betrayals, and for the women in the room, Jin-ho was the ultimate prize, a man who could buy their future or destroy it with a single phone call. At 28, Jin-ho was the undisputed heir to the Baek syndicate, a man whose shadow stretched from the shipping docks of Seoul to the skyscrapers of New York. Standing 6'2" in a tuxedo tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, he was a study in absolute control. His dark hair was slicked back, not a single strand out of place, and his jawline was sharp enough to draw blood. Beneath the fine fabric of his shirt were the scars and ink of a man who had won a war for his throne, but his face remained a sculpted masterpiece of indifference. He avoided the flashing cameras like they were sniper fire. His associates kept count, nudging him, pointing out the perfection on display, supermodels who had launched 1,000 campaigns. Jin-ho just kept sipping his champagne, feeling like he was watching a theater performance where the actors had forgotten their souls. He had grown up surrounded by beautiful things that were meant to distract or destroy him. His father had taught him early, a pretty face is the easiest place to hide a knife. He had lived by that rule for 10 years. Then the music seemed to die. Across the room, standing near the towering windows, was a woman who didn't belong in this world of glittering lies. She wasn't wearing a designer gown or a practiced mask. She wore a simple white blouse and a look of calm, quiet strength. The ironclad composure that Jin-ho had spent a decade building didn't just crack, it shattered. The champagne glass tilted in his hand, the liquid trembling. He wasn't looking at a model. He wasn't looking at a strategic play. He was looking at Claire Hart. He was looking at the only person who knew the boy he was before he became a monster. He was looking at his first love, and for the first time in 10 years, the King of Shadows was afraid. Welcome to Afro-Korean Black Crown. If the sight of a man ready to lose everything for love makes your pulse race, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and drop your city and time in the comments, because tonight the boundary between power and love has finally shattered. Baek Jin-ho moved through the ballroom like a wolf through a flock of porcelain sheep. He was a man of absolute mathematical precision. Every step was measured, every nod of his head a calculated concession. To the elite of Manhattan and the syndicate observers tucked into the corners of the room, he was more than a man. He was the King of Shadows, a title earned through a decade of blood and iron. His black tuxedo was so perfectly tailored it looked like armor, and his face, sharp and sculpted, betrayed nothing of the turbulence required to rule an empire that stretched from the docks of Seoul to the skyscrapers of New York. He stopped near a floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. Around him, the gala hummed with the sound of hollow laughter and the clinking of crystal. A group of world-renowned models, dressed in shimmering silks that cost a year's salary for the average man, drifted into his orbit. They preened and posed, casting lingering, inviting glances his way. They were the height of human beauty, yet to Jin-ho, they were mere furniture, ornaments designed to fill a room he happened to be standing in. Jin-ho, a senior associate whispered, stepping into his personal space with a predatory grin. "The merger is ready for your signature. The board is watching. You look like a man who has already won the war." Jin-ho didn't turn his head. His posture remained rigid, his discipline an impenetrable fortress. "I don't play games I haven't already won," he replied, his voice a low, melodic rasp that commanded instant silence in his immediate circle. He was a man obsessed with order, a man who believed that if he kept every strand of hair in place and every emotion under lock and key, he could never be hurt again. He took a slow sip of champagne, his gaze sweeping the room with clinical indifference. He saw the greed in the eyes of the businessmen and the desperation in the smiles of the socialites. He felt entirely, comfortably alone in his power. He was the untouchable elite, a king who had built a throne out of ice. He was certain that nothing in this glittering, artificial world could ever pierce his composure. He was the master of the shadows, and the shadows never surprised him. Then the air in the room seemed to thin. He turned his head toward the grand entrance, expecting another parade of sequins. Instead, his breath hitched, a jagged physical sensation that tore through his chest. In the center of the golden room, standing against a backdrop of shimmering models, was a woman in a simple, refined white blouse. The glass in Jin-ho's hand trembled, a microscopic movement that felt like an earthquake. The ice didn't just crack, it vanished. 10 years of discipline dissolved in a single heartbeat as his eyes locked on to Claire Hart. The king of shadows was gone. In his place stood a boy who had just seen a ghost. The world narrowed until it was nothing more than a blurred tunnel of gold and shadow, with Claire Hart standing at the end of it. The roar of the gala, the violins, the networking, the shallow flirtations was replaced by the thundering of Jin-ho's own pulse in his ears. He stood paralyzed, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. For a man whose life depended on reacting to a threat before it manifested, this sudden, total inertia was a death sentence. She was an impossible vision of simplicity. Amidst a sea of women draped in sequins that mimicked the scales of sirens, Claire wore a white blouse that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. It was modest, clean, and utterly defiant of the room's unspoken rules. To anyone else, she was an understated guest. To Jin-ho, she was a blinding flare in the dark. Her hair was pulled back just as he remembered, revealing the steady, intelligent curve of her brow. She wasn't looking for a benefactor or a billionaire. She was simply standing there, surviving, a living testament to the life he had burned to the ground 10 years ago. The models surrounding him exchanged confused glances, their practiced smiles faltering as they realized the king of shadows had stopped breathing. His senior associate followed Jin-ho's line of sight, his eyes narrowing as he landed on the woman in white. "Jin-ho, you've gone pale. Do you know that woman?" Jin-ho didn't answer. He couldn't. His jaw was a hard, sculpted line, but his eyes, those cold obsidian depths, were wide with a raw, unguarded terror. This was the one variable he hadn't calculated. He had accounted for rival syndicates, for federal stings, and for internal coups. He had not accounted for the girl who had once held his hand in the rain before he became a monster. Claire turned her head. Her gaze swept the room with a quiet, knowing strength until it collided with his. The impact was physical. Jin-ho felt his ribcage tighten as she held his stare without flinching. There was no fear in her expression, only a subtle, heartbreakingly familiar smile that suggested she had been waiting for this collision as long as he had. In that moment, the King of Shadows title was a hollow joke. The perfectly slicked hair and the tailored armor of his tuxedo couldn't hide the truth. The most feared man in Seoul and Manhattan had just been brought to his knees by a woman in a simple white blouse. The world began to whisper, the cameras of the paparazzi began to flash, but Jin-ho saw only her. The ghost had returned, and the ice he had lived in for a decade was beginning to melt into a flood. The golden glow of the gala bled into the memory of a bruised charcoal sky over the slums of Busan.
Before the skyscrapers of Manhattan, there was the salt-heavy air of the docks and the sound of rain drumming against rusted, corrugated iron. 10 years ago, Bak Jin-ho hadn't been a king. He had been a boy with bloody knuckles and a heart that still knew how to beat for someone else. Claire had been the only light in that gray world. He remembered her leaning against the brick wall of their shared alleyway, her presence as calm and steady then as it was now. While the other kids stayed away from the boy whose father was a mid-level enforcer for the syndicate, Claire had reached out. She had bandaged his scraped hands with strips of her own school uniform, her intelligent eyes seeing past the burgeoning violence in his soul. "You don't have to be what they say you are, Jin-ho," she had whispered, a simple truth that felt like a lifeline. But the shadows of the Bak syndicate were long, and they eventually claimed him. The night of the transition remained etched in his mind like a scar. His father had been executed in a power struggle, and the elders had come for Jin-ho, not to kill him, but to mold him. They saw the cold steel in his gaze and knew he was the only heir capable of uniting the warring factions. "If you stay, she dies," the lead elder had told him, pointing a gnarled finger toward the flickering light in Claire's window. "Your love is a target, your heart is a liability. To keep her breathing, you must become a ghost." He hadn't even said goodbye. To speak to her would have been to mark her for death. He remembered standing in the shadows across from her home, watching her wait for him at their usual spot until the sun went down. He had gripped the cold iron of the gate until his palms bled, forcing himself to turn away, to board the plane to Seoul, and to bury the boy he was under layers of ice and ruthlessness. For 10 years, silence had been his only gift to her. He had monitored her from a distance, unseen, a guardian made of shadows, ensuring she had the scholarship, the safety, and the life she deserved, all while he climbed a mountain of bones to reach his throne. He had convinced himself that she was a closed chapter, a beautiful dream he had sacrificed for her own survival. But as he stood in the center of the Manhattan Gala, the silence of a decade shattered. She wasn't a memory or a protected asset anymore. She was here, she was real, and the boy who had once loved her was screaming to be let out of his cage.
The moment Claire turned to leave the ballroom, the air seemed to rush back into Jin-ho's lungs, cold and sharp. He didn't follow her immediately. That would be a tactical error, a public admission of the crack in his armor. Instead, he signaled to his security detail with a fractional tilt of his head, a gesture that meant, "Stand down." He needed to be the one to do this. He shed his champagne glass and his senior associates as if they were nothing more than ghosts, slipping through the side exit with a fluid, predatory grace that ensured no one noticed the King of Shadows had vacated his throne. Outside, the Manhattan air was biting, a stark contrast to the stifling perfume of the Gala. He kept a precise distance, a ghost among the steam rising from the subway grates and the neon flicker of Midtown. Claire walked with that same unhurried, steady pace he remembered from their youth, her white blouse glowing like a beacon under the harsh street lamps. She didn't look back, but Jin-ho felt a prickle of intuition at the base of his neck. The city was never just a city to a man like him. It was a map of potential trajectories and kill zones. He moved through the shadows of the alleyways parallel to her path, his eyes scanning the rooftops and the blacked-out SUVs idling at the curbs. He saw them before they saw her. 2 men in nondescript leather jackets, their eyes too fixed, their movements too synchronized. They were syndicate scouts, the eyes of the elders, sent to investigate the woman who had made the king freeze. A surge of protective fury, ancient and volatile, rose in Jin-ho's chest. As Claire rounded a quieter corner toward the residential district, the scouts began to close the gap. Jin-ho stepped out of the darkness behind them, his movements silent, his presence a sudden, overwhelming weight. He didn't use a weapon, he didn't need one. He caught the first man by the throat, his grip a vice of iron, and leaned in close. "Tell the elders," Jin-ho whispered, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that belonged to the monster they had created, "that if a single shadow falls across her path, I will burn the syndicate to the ground with everyone still inside it." He didn't wait for a reply before shoving the man into his companion. They scrambled away, terrified by the raw, unhinged look in their leader's eyes. Jin-ho smoothed the front of his tuxedo, his breathing finally leveling out. He watched from the darkness as Claire reached the door of her apartment building. She paused for a heartbeat, her hand on the handle, and looked back toward the empty street. She didn't see him, but she smiled, a soft, knowing tilt of the lips, before disappearing inside. Jin-ho remained in the shadows for a long time, a king standing guard over a world he no longer wanted to rule without her.
The hallway of Claire's apartment building was narrow, smelling faintly of lemon wax and old paper, a world away from the sterile, velvet-lined corridors Jin-ho usually inhabited. He stood before her door, his presence an anomaly in the dim light. In his hand, he held the weight of a decade's worth of unspoken words. He didn't knock like a normal man. He stood there until the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to pull the door open from the inside. Claire didn't scream. She didn't even look surprised. She stood in the threshold, her white blouse now tucked into a pair of soft trousers, the domestic warmth of her small apartment spilling out behind her. The contrast was violent. Jin-ho, in his $3,000 tuxedo, looked like a dark god who had accidentally wandered into a sanctuary. "You're late, Jin-ho," she said softly. Her voice was the same, a calm harbor in the storm of his life. 10 years is a long time to keep someone standing in the rain. Jin-ho stepped into the room, his eyes instantly cataloging the space. It was filled with books, a half-finished cup of tea, and the quiet dignity of a life built without him. Every detail felt like a strike against his soul. He had lived in palaces of marble and glass, yet this small, lived-in room felt more substantial than his entire empire. He turned to face her, his rigid posture finally beginning to fail him. "You shouldn't have been there tonight," he said, his voice raspy and thick with the authority he used to mask his fear. "The gala, it wasn't safe for you. You were never supposed to be seen." "I stopped hiding a long time ago," Claire replied, stepping closer until she was within the circle of his shadow. She didn't flinch at the coldness radiating from him. Instead, she reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the lapel of his jacket. "You look like you've been holding your breath for a decade. Is that what being a king feels like?" "It feels like being a target," he snapped, the ice in his voice cracking to reveal the raw nerves beneath. "My world doesn't allow for weaknesses, Claire. They will come for you to get to me." "Then let them come," she said, her steady gaze meeting his frantic one. She finally closed the distance, her palm resting flat against his chest, right over his racing heart. The clash of their worlds was absolute. He was a man defined by violence and control. She was a woman defined by resilience and truth. For the first time in his adult life, Jin-ho felt the crushing weight of his crown. He looked down at her hand against his black silk, the white of her skin a staggering reminder of everything he had sacrificed. He had come here to warn her, to push her away, but as her warmth seeped through his armor, he realized the terrifying truth. He was no longer capable of leaving her behind. Jin-ho did not take her to a 5-star restaurant or a private club where the walls were lined with the sycophants who feared him. Instead, he led her to a quiet, subterranean kitchen in a corner of the city where the neon signs flickered in Korean script and the air smelled of charcoal and bone broth. It was a place where the syndicate did its most honest business, away from the polish of Manhattan, deep within the marrow of the underworld. The owner, an old man with eyes like clouded glass, bowed low and vanished, leaving them in a private alcove lit by a single low-hanging bulb. Jin-ho removed his tuxedo jacket, tossing it onto the wooden bench with a rare carelessness. For the first time, he loosened his tie and unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling back the sleeves of his crisp white shirt. As he reached for the kettle, the light hit his forearms, revealing the map of his history. Jagged silver lines cut through his skin, the legacy of a knife fight in the alleys of Incheon, a puckered circular mark near his wrist from a night he had to prove his loyalty to the elders. They were not just scars, they were the price of his throne. Claire did not look away. She reached across the table, her fingers tracing the long, pale line that disappeared beneath his watch. "This one," she whispered, her touch sending a jolt through him that no bullet ever could. This wasn't from a war, was it? Jin-ho stared at the scar, his jaw tightening. "The first month after I left you, I tried to run back. The elders caught me before I reached the airport. They wanted me to remember that my body no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the syndicate." He looked up, his eyes searching hers for the pity he expected, the pity he loathed. But there was only a fierce, burning intelligence in her gaze. "You think these make you a monster," she said, her voice steady, "but all I see is a man who survived being buried alive." "I am a monster, Claire," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low frequency. "The things I've had to do to keep this power, they would haunt your dreams. This dinner isn't a date, it's a warning. Look at me. Look at what I've become. This is the real me. I am a collection of wounds held together by a silk suit." "No," she replied, her hand moving from his scar to his cheek, forcing him to face the light. "You're a man who thinks he has to be the shadow to protect the light, but you're forgetting that shadows can't exist without it." The invitation was silent but clear. He was asking her to step into his darkness, and she was daring him to remember the sun. The danger wasn't in the rival gangs or the elders watching from the street. It was in the way Jin-ho felt his ironclad heart beginning to beat for something other than survival. The sanctuary of the quiet kitchen was shattered before the tea had even grown cold. Jin-ho's phone vibrated against the wooden table, a low, rhythmic hum that sounded like a funeral march. He didn't have to look at the screen to know who was calling. The air in the room instantly curdled, the domestic warmth he had momentarily stolen with Claire evaporating into the familiar chill of his reality. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice returning to that icy, impenetrable monotone. He stepped into the damp alleyway behind the restaurant, the humidity of the night clinging to his white shirt like a second skin. A black sedan sat idling at the mouth of the alley, its headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. The rear window rolled down just an inch, revealing the silver-gray hair and the cold, sagging features of Elder Park, the man who had overseen Jin-ho's transformation from a grieving boy into a ruthless king. "The gala was a display of weakness, Jin-ho." The elder's voice was like dry parchment rubbing together. "The board is whispering. The rival families are laughing. They say the King of Shadows has been blinded by a ghost in a white blouse." Jin-ho stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, though his knuckles whitened. "She is a civilian. She is of no consequence to the syndicate." "She is a killing heel," the elder spat, using the syndicate's term for a fatal vulnerability. "A woman who can make you freeze in a room full of your peers is a woman who can be used to dismantle everything we have built. The Black Lady, as the scouts are calling her, has your heart, Jin-ho, and in our world a heart is just a target for a knife." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The elder's eyes drifted toward the door of the restaurant. "The code of the shadows is absolute. A leader with a weakness is a leader who must be replaced. Either you excise this cancer yourself, or we will do it for you. We will not allow the Bayek Syndicate to fall because you remembered how to feel." The window rolled up and the sedan pulled away into the Manhattan fog, leaving Jin-ho alone in the dark.
He felt the crushing weight of the throne more than ever before. He had spent 10 years building a fortress of ice to keep her safe, only for his own longing to lead the wolves straight to her door. He turned back toward the restaurant, watching Claire's silhouette through the frosted glass. She was peaceful, unaware that she had just been sentenced to death by the men who had made him a king. To save her, he would have to do more than protect her. He would have to become the very monster she thought he had outgrown.
The following afternoon, the city felt different, heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. Jin-ho had surrounded Claire's apartment with his most loyal men, a ring of invisible steel, but he had underestimated the desperation of the Choi clan. The Chois were scavengers, a rival gang that had spent years lurking in the syndicate's shadow, waiting for the king to bleed. To them, Jin-ho's sudden distraction wasn't just a scandal, it was an opening. The trap was sprung with a surgical, terrifying efficiency. It happened in the 3 minutes Claire spent walking from her front door to the cafe on the corner. A delivery van veered onto the sidewalk, blocking the line of sight for Jin-ho's snipers. By the time the smoke cleared, the street was empty. Jin-ho was in a board meeting when his phone buzzed with a single image. Claire, strapped to a rusted chair in a warehouse that smelled of salt and stale oil. She wasn't crying. Even in the grainy photo, her eyes remained steady, though her white blouse was stained with the grime of her captors. Below the image was an address in the meatpacking district and a simple command: come alone or the girl dies. When Jin-ho arrived, he didn't look like a businessman or a socialite. He looked like the end of the world. He walked through the warehouse doors with his hands visible, his face a mask of such profound, icy stillness that even the Choi enforcers stepped back. The leader of the clan, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, stood over Claire, a switchblade tracing the line of her jaw. "The great Baek Jin-ho," the man sneered, pressing the blade just hard enough to indent the skin. The man who ignored the world's most beautiful models, brought to his knees by a girl in a cheap shirt. "What's the price of a smile, Jin-ho? Is it worth your empire?" Jin-ho didn't blink. He didn't look at the dozen guns pointed at his chest. He looked only at Claire. He saw the way she watched him, not with a plea for rescue, but with a terrifyingly calm understanding. She knew what he was about to become. "You think you found my weakness," Jin-ho said, his voice dropping to a hollow, soul-chilling whisper. "But you've made a mistake. You haven't found my weakness. You found the only thing that kept me from killing every person in this room." He took a single step forward. The air in the warehouse seemed to drop 20 degrees. "The price of her smile isn't my empire," Jin-ho continued, his eyes turning into black voids of predatory intent. "The price is your existence. I'm going to show you why they call me the King of Shadows." The warehouse fell into a silence so heavy it felt physical. Jin-ho did not reach for a gun. A man of his stature did not need to reach. He was the weapon. He moved with a blurred, terrifying speed that defied his rigid tuxedo, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. Before the leader of the Choi clan could even tighten his grip on the switchblade, Jin-ho was there. He didn't just strike, he dismantled. With a sickening crunch, he shattered the man's wrist, the blade clattering to the concrete floor like a discarded toy. The enforcers hesitated. The sheer, unhinged ferocity of the King of Shadows was a legend they were now witnessing in agonizing detail. Jin-ho didn't stop. He became a whirlwind of calculated, brutal efficiency. He moved through the room not as a man, but as a force of nature designed for erasure. Every strike was precise, every movement intended to break bone and spirit. He didn't look at the men he was destroying. His eyes remained fixed on Claire, even as blood splattered the white silk of his shirt. The leader, clutching his ruined arm, scrambled backward, his bravado replaced by a primal, stuttering terror.
"You're a demon," he gasped, his back hitting a stack of iron crates. Jin-ho ignored him. He walked to the center of the room where Claire sat bound. He picked up the fallen switchblade. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. The elder's warning echoed in his mind. Excise the cancer. To the world watching through the security cameras he knew were hidden in the rafters, this was the moment he was supposed to prove his coldness. He leaned down, the blade inches from Claire's throat. But he didn't cut her. He sliced through her zip-tie restraints with a single savage flick. Then he turned back to the Choi leader. Jin-ho's face was splattered with red, his hair finally out of place, a single dark lock falling over his forehead. He looked like the monster the syndicate had spent 10 years perfecting. "You wanted to see the king," Jin-ho whispered, stepping over the groaning bodies of the fallen enforcers. He grabbed the leader by the throat and hoisted him upward, the man's feet dangling off the floor. The king doesn't negotiate. The king burns the field so nothing can ever grow there again. With a terrifying, cold-blooded resolve, Jin-ho didn't just end the threat, he began the systematic destruction of the Choi clan's entire network via a series of rapid-fire commands into his headset, ordering his shadows to execute a total eclipse on their holdings. It was a monstrous display of over-calculation, a scorched earth response that went far beyond rescue. He was showing the world that for Claire, he would not just kill, he would annihilate. When he finally turned back to Claire, the monster was still visible in his eyes. He reached out a blood-stained hand to touch her face, his fingers trembling. He had saved her, but in doing so, he had shown her exactly how much of a ghost he had truly become.
The air in the warehouse was thick with the copper tang of blood and the heavy, ringing silence that follows a massacre. Jin-ho stood over the ruins of his enemies, his chest heaving, the pristine white of his sleeves ruined by the visceral reality of his work. He reached for Claire, his blood-stained hand trembling as he moved to brush a stray hair from her forehead. He expected fear. He expected her to flinch from the monster he had just unveiled. Instead, Claire stood up, her movements fluid and agonizingly calm. She didn't look at the broken men on the floor. She looked directly into Jin-ho's eyes, searching for the boy she had once bandaged in the rain. What she found was a man who had become a god of destruction to keep her breathing. "You've become exactly what they wanted, Jin-ho," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "They told you I was a weakness, so you became a nightmare to protect me. But don't you see? That's how they win. They've turned your love into a weapon." "I did what was necessary," Jin-ho rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let them touch you again. I have the power to keep you safe now, Claire. I am the king." "No," she said, stepping back, putting a distance between them that felt wider than the 10 years they had spent apart. "You're a prisoner, and as long as I'm here, I'm just the bars on your cage. The elders are right about one thing. I am your killing heel. As long as I'm in your world, you will keep staining your soul to keep mine clean. I won't be the reason you lose the last of your humanity." She turned toward the warehouse doors, the same simple white blouse she had worn to the gala, now wrinkled and grayed by the night's violence. "Where are you going?" Jin-ho demanded, his iron discipline finally shattering into raw, panicked desperation. "You can't leave. The syndicate, the Choi survivors, they'll hunt you the second you step out of my shadow." "Then let them hunt a ghost," Claire replied, pausing at the threshold. She looked back one last time, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips, the same smile that had haunted his dreams for a decade. "I left once to save my life, Jin-ho. I'm leaving now to save yours.
You don't need to be a king of shadows for me. You just need to be a man. And you can't be that as long as you're holding a throne in one hand and my leash in the other." She stepped out into the pre-dawn fog of the meatpacking district, her silhouette fading into the gray mist. Jin-ho took a step to follow, then stopped. He looked at his hands, slick with the price of his power. He realized that she was right. To truly protect her, he couldn't just kill his enemies. He had to kill the king. The elders gathered in the high-security sanctum of the back syndicate, their faces illuminated by the cold blue light of a dozen monitors. They expected Jin-ho to enter and kneel, to offer a penance for his distraction. They expected him to confirm that Claire Hart had been disposed of. Instead, when the heavy oak doors swung open, Jin-ho walked in with the gait of a man who had already walked through fire and found he liked the heat. He didn't take his seat at the head of the table. He stood before them, dressed in a fresh charcoal gray suit, his hair slicked back with a precision that felt more like a threat than a style choice. He placed a single encrypted tablet on the mahogany surface. "The merger is complete," Jin-ho stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Elder Park leaned forward, a greedy glint in his eyes. "Excellent. The Manhattan holdings are secured then." "No," Jin-ho said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face, a smile that didn't reach his hollow eyes. "The merger isn't with a rival family. I've liquidated every shell company, every offshore account, and every deed the syndicate has held for 50 years. I've folded the Beck syndicate into a blind charitable trust dedicated to the very hospitals this gala was meant to support. By dawn, the King of Shadows will own nothing but the suit he is standing in." The room erupted. The elders surged to their feet, their faces contorted in a mix of fury and disbelief. "You've destroyed us," Park screamed, his hand reaching for the silent alarm. "You've burned the throne." "I haven't just burned it, I've sold the ashes. I've turned over the ledgers, the shipping manifests, and the names of every associate in this room to the federal authorities. The price of our freedom, Claire's and mine, was the total annihilation of your empire." He leaned over the table, his shadows stretching long and dark across the panicked men. "You told me she was my weakness. You were wrong. She was the only thing that made me care about keeping this throne intact. Without her, I have no reason to play your games. I am the man who has nothing left to lose, which makes me the most dangerous man you have ever met." As the distant wail of sirens began to echo through the reinforced glass of the skyscraper, Jin-ho turned his back on the men who had raised him to be a monster. He walked toward the elevator, his stride light and unburdened. He had spent 10 years building a kingdom of ice, and in a single night of fire, he had bought back his soul. He wasn't the King of Shadows anymore. He was a ghost, finally stepping into the light to find the only thing that mattered. The sun rose over the East River, not with the harsh glare of a neon spotlight, but with a soft, persistent warmth that bled through the morning mist. On the quiet pier, far from the sirens and the crumbling ruins of the back syndicate, Jin-ho stood watching the water. He was no longer the man in the armored tuxedo. He wore a simple coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and for the first time in a decade, his hair was ruffled by the wind, not a single drop of product holding the strands in place. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. They were steady and sure, the footsteps of a woman who had never needed a king to find her way. Claire stopped beside him, the early light catching the radiant glow of her skin. She didn't look at the city skyline, which now felt less like a chessboard and more like a collection of buildings. She looked at him. "I heard the news," she said softly. "The shadows are gone, Jin-ho. Everyone is talking about the man who gave away a kingdom for a ghost." Jin-ho turned to her. The sharp, lethal edges of his jaw seemed to have softened, the icy void in his eyes replaced by a quiet, grounded peace. "I didn't give it away," he replied, his voice no longer a command, but a confession. "I traded a prison for a life. I told you once that I was a collection of wounds held together by silk. I've burned the silk. Now I'm just a man." He reached out, and this time his hand didn't tremble. He took her hand in his fingers interlacing with hers. There were no bloodstains, no heavy rings of office, just the warmth of two people who had finally stopped running. "The elders, the rivals, they'll never stop looking for the man you were," Claire whispered, though there was no fear in her expression. "Let them look," Jinho said, looking out at the horizon where the gold of the sun met the blue of the sea. "That man died in a warehouse. The king is dead, Claire, and I've found a much better kingdom." He pulled her close, and as they stood together, two silhouettes against the waking world, the power dynamic had finally shifted into a perfect, quiet balance. There were no more decorative statues, no more shimmering masks, and no more secrets hidden in the dark. They were no longer defined by what they had lost or what they had survived. They were simply two souls standing as one in the light of a new day. The shocking move wasn't just the destruction of an empire, it was the quiet courage to begin again, together. If you felt the ice crack when Jinho finally looked at Claire, or if you were breathless when he burned his throne to the ground, smash that like button. Subscribe to join the Empire and never miss a cinematic story of power and passion. Drop a comment below and tell me, which moment destroyed you? Was it the frozen stare at the gala, the sacrifice in the warehouse, or that final sunrise on the pier? Thanks for being here. Remember, in a world of shadows, the most powerful thing you can do is hold on to your light. You never know whose world you might change just by being exactly who you are. See you in the next one.